She called the cops to bully me. Too bad I'm the chief. It was a quiet Saturday morning, the kind that made you forget the chaos of the work week. The sunlight streamed softly through the kitchen windows, bouncing off the polished countertops, and the smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air. I had just poured myself a mug, rich and dark, and was scrolling through my emails, savoring the rare, peaceful start to my weekend. Normally, Saturdays were for errands, yard work, and maybe a slow breakfast, but there was a comforting rhythm to these mornings that I cherished. The neighborhood had its usual buzz, even on a weekend. Lawns were being mowed, sprinklers hissed over manicured gardens, and the distant hum of kids riding bicycles created a low, constant soundtrack. From time to time, a neighbor would wave from across the street, exchanging polite nods, small talk about the weather, or comments about local events. The sense of community was there, but beneath it, a subtle undercurrent always ran, an invisible tension that only those who lived here long enough could feel. As I sipped my coffee and skimmed through routine emails, most of them were mundane. A landscaping concern here, a minor noise complaint there, the occasional note about lost pets or package deliveries gone astray. It was all ordinary, expected, an endless stream of small inconveniences and petty grievances. I was used to them. What I wasn't used to was the email that popped into my inbox just as I was finishing the first sip of coffee, the subject line simple and casual: quick favor. I opened it, expecting the usual HOA-related concern. Instead, my eyes widened in disbelief. It was from Karen, the HOA president herself. Her name alone could stir tension in the neighborhood, though few would admit it openly. Karen had a reputation, assertive, controlling, and relentless when she thought she was in the right, and yet her email was almost audacious. She wrote, "Hi there, I'm running low on gasoline and can't make it to the station today. Could you share some of your supply? Thanks in advance." I blinked twice, then read it again just to make sure I hadn't misread. Gasoline from me, free of charge. I set my coffee down slowly, the steam curling up as if mocking the absurdity of the request. I glanced out the window, expecting perhaps to see a gas truck stuck in the driveway or some kind of emergency. Nothing. Just the quiet hum of suburbia, children playing down the street, and the occasional bark of a neighbor's dog. The audacity of it hit me. Asking a neighbor for personal gasoline wasn't just unusual, it was bizarre. And asking me, personally, to hand over a portion of my own supply without so much as a hint of consideration for boundaries or propriety felt invasive. I leaned back in my chair, pondering my options. Politely ignore it, reply curtly, or, given my patience levels on a Saturday morning, respond with measured firmness. I opted for the last because I had learned long ago that confrontation could be avoided, but principle was worth defending. I tapped out a reply. "Hi Karen, I'm sorry, but I cannot give out personal supplies of gasoline. I hope you find a solution." Sent. I exhaled slowly, expecting that to be the end of it. Surely, a responsible adult, even one as notoriously controlling as Karen, would accept a polite refusal. But the universe, it seemed, had other plans. Within minutes, my phone buzzed. A text this time, from Karen. I glanced at it, hoping it might be a simple acknowledgement. Instead, it read, "That's disappointing. I didn't expect this from you. Hope you reconsider." I stared at the screen, incredulous. This was not how adult conversations normally went, at least not outside of sitcoms. And yet, here I was, caught in what felt like the opening salvo of a battle I hadn't even signed up for. A sense of unease began to creep in. It wasn't just the request itself, it was the tone that lingered beneath her words. Disappointment. That single word carried a subtle threat, a reminder that Karen wielded her authority with precision and expectation. Refusing her favor, even politely, had apparently struck a nerve. I shrugged it off, hoping she would drop it. Surely she would, surely. But as I sat there, sipping the cooling coffee, I noticed something else. An almost imperceptible shift in the neighborhood atmosphere. A few cars slowed a little too long near my house. A neighbor's dog barked sharply. The faint hum of chatter seemed to have an edge that hadn't been there before. Of course, it could have been coincidence, but something told me it was. By midday, the pattern became clearer. A call from another HOA member, asking innocuous questions but with a tone that suggested curiosity or maybe surveillance. A casual drive-by by the HOA board president herself, as if timing her rounds to match my every movement. It was subtle, but intentional. I realized then that this wasn't just about gasoline. This was about control, about testing boundaries, about sending a message. And unfortunately for Karen, she had picked the wrong neighbor to try it on. I spent the rest of the morning reflecting on how a simple no could escalate into a neighborhood-wide spectacle. Coffee long finished, I turned my attention to the rest of my day, knowing deep down that the Saturday calm was temporary and the real storm was only beginning. Little did I know that this single, seemingly minor refusal, the polite decline of a gasoline request, would spiral into a full-blown conflict. Calls, complaints, and petty power plays would follow, and I would soon learn that in this neighborhood, boundaries weren't respected, they were tested. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, I couldn't shake the feeling that the quiet Saturday morning was already a thing of the past. The email had been a small spark, and somewhere deep down, I could sense that it was about to ignite a wildfire. And Karen, well, Karen had just made the first move in a game she didn't fully understand, and I was more than ready to respond. A few hours after sending my polite refusal to Karen's outrageous gasoline request, my phone rang. The display flashed 911, and for a split second my heart skipped a beat. Normally, a call from 911 wasn't cause for panic. I was the chief, after all, but the timing was uncanny. Saturday mornings were supposed to be quiet. Coffee, emails, maybe a leisurely walk through the neighborhood, not the opening act of a suburban scandal. "Chief, we've got a situation," my dispatcher said, trying and failing to mask a hint of amusement in her voice. "The HOA president is claiming you're hoarding fuel illegally and demanding police intervention." I froze. Did she just say hoarding fuel? And illegal? My mind raced. Was this some kind of elaborate prank? But there was no prankster vibe here. Karen was entirely serious. I laughed, a low chuckle that was part disbelief, part irritation. Of all the calls a police chief could get, this one had to be the most absurd in recent memory. People called for noise complaints, domestic disturbances, traffic accidents, maybe even a few minor thefts. But gasoline disputes with their HOA president, that was a new one. I took a deep breath and steadied myself. If there's one thing I've learned in law enforcement, it's that no situation is too ridiculous to take seriously, especially when it involves neighborhood politics and someone who thought their HOA authority was absolute. By the time I arrived at the scene, the neighborhood was buzzing. Word travels fast when drama is involved, and apparently this particular brand of drama was irresistible. Cars were parked along the streets, neighbors craning their necks to see what was unfolding. The smell of cut grass mingled with the faint scent of gasoline from my own tank, though I hadn't even left home with any. There she was, Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of the homeowners association, standing front and center in her usual battle-ready stance. Her perfectly manicured hands waved a stack of HOA paperwork like a general brandishing orders before a campaign. Her face was flushed, eyes wide with a combination of fury and disbelief. "He's refusing to share gas," she shouted, projecting her voice across the small crowd that had gathered. "This is outrageous. You need to do something." The spectacle was something to behold. On any normal day, her indignation might have been amusing. Today, however, it felt like an opera of absurdity, and I was the unwilling lead. I stepped out of my car, walking slowly, deliberately, giving the neighbors a moment to take in the scene. I could see the whispers spreading, the phones already raised to capture what they probably assumed would be a confrontation worthy of social media. I raised my hands in a calming gesture, letting my presence speak before I opened my mouth. The chatter quieted. Corinne's face froze mid-expression, her lips forming a wordless gasp as she processed the sight of me approaching. "Good morning, everyone," I began, keeping my voice even, authoritative but calm. "Let's take a moment here. Corinne, I understand you're upset, but I think we need to clarify a few things." Her hands trembled slightly as she held up the HOA paperwork. "Clarify. He's refusing to share gasoline. This is illegal. I'm your HOA president. You." I raised a finger, cutting her off gently but firmly. "Let's slow down. First, let's make one thing perfectly clear." I paused for effect, letting the gathered crowd lean in subconsciously, sensing the gravity or the comedy of the moment. "I am the police chief here." The silence that followed was immediate and complete. Conversation stopped mid-word. Neighbors' phones lowered slightly, unsure whether to capture or simply watch. Corinne's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again, as if the words she had carefully rehearsed had suddenly evaporated. I, she stammered. Her voice cracked slightly, betraying her fury and embarrassment. You're the chief." I nodded slowly, deliberately. "Yes, Corinne, I am the chief, and I am also a neighbor like everyone else here. That means the same rules apply to me as they do to anyone else, including your requests for free gasoline." A few neighbors exchanged amused glances, whispering softly among themselves. I could practically hear their thoughts. She called the cops on the chief. Corinne's face flushed deeper, a mix of fury and the dawning realization that she had misjudged the situation spectacularly. Her battle flag of HOA documents drooped slightly in her hands as she struggled to regroup. "But the rules, the association." "The rules of the HOA," I interrupted, keeping my voice calm but firm, "do not override the law, nor do they grant any member the authority to demand personal property from another resident, especially not from the police chief standing before you." She opened her mouth again, likely to argue, but I raised a hand, signaling her to stop. "Corinne, I suggest we end this here before things escalate unnecessarily. This isn't about gasoline. This is about boundaries, and you've just tested the wrong one." The crowd reacted immediately. Some laughed quietly, trying to stifle it, while others shook their heads in disbelief. The tension shifted, the power dynamic reversed in an instant. Corinne's carefully cultivated image of authority began to crumble in front of her audience. I could see it, the frustration, the indignation, the slowly dawning humiliation. She waved her HOA papers frantically, like a magician trying to conjure authority from thin air, but the effect was lost. The documents were meaningless in this context. They couldn't override the law, nor could they force me to hand over fuel that belonged to me. "Now," I continued, my tone even, but carrying the weight of command, "I suggest we all take a breath. Corinne, you may want to reconsider your approach next time before calling 911 over something this trivial. And neighbors, thank you for your interest, but this matter is resolved." Some in the crowd chuckled outright, others shook their heads, some still unsure whether to believe their eyes. Corinne stood frozen, the papers slipping slightly from her hands. A neighbor whispered audibly. She called the cops on the chief, earning a stifled laugh from a few nearby. I glanced around at the gathering crowd, letting the moment settle. This wasn't a public humiliation. It was a lesson in perspective, boundaries, and the perils of wielding perceived authority without understanding the full situation. Corinne's attempt to escalate had backfired spectacularly, and the neighborhood had witnessed it firsthand. By the time I returned to my car, Corinne was muttering under her breath, muttering threats about rules and procedures, but the bite had gone out of her words. The power she thought she held had evaporated in the sunlight of reality. As I drove away, I couldn't help but smile. A simple refusal to give out gasoline had turned into a spectacle no one would forget anytime soon. And while Corinne's fury would undoubtedly simmer, one thing was clear. In this neighborhood, authority could be challenged, and boundaries were not to be ignored, even by the HOA president herself. The call had backfired spectacularly, and the stage was set for the next act of what was quickly becoming the saga of Karen versus the chief. Karen didn't notice the subtle detail tucked into my casual jacket, the small glint of metal that marked my true position of authority. It wasn't meant to intimidate, at least, not overtly, but it carried weight, a badge that reflected years of service, training, and the kind of responsibility that extended far beyond HOA bylaws. I could see the effect it had on the neighborhood already. A subtle shift in posture, the quiet clearing of throats, the slight widening of eyes as people began to understand the absurdity of the situation they had just stumbled into. I stepped closer, deliberately slowing my pace so the crowd could fully register what was happening. "Karen," I said, keeping my voice calm, even and measured. "While I respect HOA rules and the spirit of community, personal property cannot be commandeered. Your request is not only unreasonable, it's not enforceable under any law, HOA provision, or common sense." Karen's face flushed an even deeper shade of red, her composure slipping as she fumbled with the stack of HOA documents she clutched in her hands like a lifeline. Her eyes darted to the crowd, searching for support, perhaps a few nods of agreement. But instead, she was met with raised eyebrows, stifled chuckles, and the occasional sympathetic shake of the head. The neighbors were silently witnessing a very different kind of authority, the kind grounded in law and principle rather than position on a committee. She spluttered, struggling to regain her footing in the debate. "But it says here," she began, her voice rising slightly, the words trembling at the edges. "It says nothing about forced gasoline donations," I interrupted, my tone firm but composed. "I'm happy to discuss neighborhood concerns, disputes, and maintenance issues, but personal resources like my gasoline supply remain private. That's not up for negotiation." The crowd murmured, some impressed, some entertained. A few whispered to each other, their voices tinged with amusement. She really tried to call the cops on the chief. I could see the ripple of realization spreading across the faces around me. Karen had escalated a personal grievance into what was now an embarrassing public spectacle, and she was slowly grasping the consequences. Karen's hands shook slightly as she tried to hold onto her authority. "But I am the president of the HOA. I represent the community. You have to." "You represent the community," I said carefully, letting each word land, "and that is respected. But representation does not equate to personal entitlement. You cannot demand access to someone else's property simply because your position gives you perceived influence." Her eyes narrowed, a flash of indignation lighting them. The veins along her temples pulsed as she opened her mouth again, ready to unleash another wave of HOA jargon. But I held up a hand, signaling for patience, for control, for reason to prevail over chaos. "Karen," I continued, deliberately slowing my speech for emphasis, "leadership in any neighborhood, any organization is not about coercion. It is about communication, negotiation, and understanding boundaries. You cannot dictate or intimidate simply because you hold a title. Authority is earned, not assumed." I glanced at the neighbors surrounding us. Some leaned on fences, their arms crossed, smirking quietly. A few younger residents whispered to each other, clearly enjoying the spectacle. The older ones shook their heads, perhaps thinking of their own encounters with overzealous HOA members in the past. Everyone was watching, silently acknowledging the lesson that was unfolding before them, a real-time masterclass in civics, civility, and the limits of power. Karen's attempts to rebut faltered as she realized that her arguments had no foundation outside of the documents in her hand. She waved the papers weakly, hopping for effect, but they were meaningless in the context of the law. Her usual tactics, bullying, intimidation, dramatic appeals, were ineffective here, and she knew it. Her usual aura of confidence had been replaced by a slow, dawning panic. The crowd shifted uncomfortably as they took in the full picture. Here was a woman who had prided herself on control and influence, now reduced to bluster in the face of someone who had not only the authority, but the presence of mind to enforce boundaries calmly and legally. It was a moment of quiet revelation, one that reminded everyone that power without accountability is fragile. I saw the frustration building in her hands, the subtle trembling as she tried to regain composure. "But it's for the good of the community," she protested weakly, though her voice no longer carried the force it once had. "Karen," I said, softening my tone slightly, "the good of the community is about cooperation, not coercion. It's about discussion, not demands. And it certainly isn't about using your position to pressure a neighbor into giving up personal property. That's not leadership. That's entitlement." Her face turned a darker shade of red, almost matching the flowers she had planted meticulously in her front yard. She looked down at the papers in her hand, as if realizing for the first time that they were irrelevant in the face of true authority. The crowd, meanwhile, began to disperse subtly, some chuckling under their breath, others nodding in quiet acknowledgement of the principle just demonstrated. Karen's breathing quickened, a mix of frustration and disbelief. She tried one last time to assert herself, but the words came out jumbled, a stammering mix of HOA regulations and rhetorical flourishes that had no bearing on reality. I took a deliberate step back, letting the lesson land. "Authority," I said, addressing both Karen and the onlookers, "is not measured by titles, paperwork, or volume of voice. It is measured by the respect you earn, the fairness you show, and the integrity with which you act. Those are the foundations of real leadership. Everything else is just noise." Karen's shoulders slumped slightly as the weight of her failed attempt settled in. The neighborhood had witnessed it, the public unraveling of a carefully constructed persona, the collapse of assumed authority in the face of reason, law, and calm composure. The crowd began to murmur appreciatively, some clapping lightly, though discreetly. A few neighbors approached me later, whispering compliments, some even joking about starting a Karen watch to track her next overreach. The lesson had been absorbed not just by Karen, but by everyone present. Titles mean little without understanding, boundaries must be respected, and authority is meaningless if it isn't wielded responsibly. Karen, meanwhile, remained red-faced and flustered, clutching her HOA paperwork with less conviction than before. I could see the gears turning in her mind, perhaps already planning the next overreach, the next attempt to assert control. But she had learned something important, even if she wouldn't admit it openly. She had picked the wrong person to bully. I turned away slowly, giving her a final nod. "Let's remember this is a neighborhood," I said gently, "not a battlefield. Cooperation works better than coercion." As I walked back to my car, Karen stood frozen, her glare following me. The crowd had largely dispersed, whispers of amusement fading into casual neighborhood chatter. But the lesson lingered, clear and unambiguous. In this neighborhood, authority must be earned, not assumed, and boundaries are not suggestions, they are rules. And Karen, well, she had just learned that lesson the hard way. Karen's pride had never been fragile. At least she didn't think it was. But after the previous confrontation, her composure was cracking at the seams. She was determined not to lose face, convinced that escalation could somehow restore her perceived authority. She straightened her back, squared her shoulders, and marched, paperwork in hand, toward the phone, her expression a mixture of indignation, disbelief, and simmering fury. "Step aside, everyone," she barked, ignoring the curious onlookers now gathered in front of my house. "I am filing a formal complaint with the police department. This is outrageous. He refuses to comply with basic HOA requests, and I demand an investigation." I raised an eyebrow, keeping my posture relaxed and deliberate. Every movement was slow and calm, in stark contrast to her flailing, dramatic gestures. Karen's performance had reached peak absurdity, and I decided to let the moment unfold naturally, like watching a storm build before the inevitable lightning strike. She dialed the number with trembling fingers, muttering instructions to whoever answered, her voice escalating in pitch and volume with every word. The gathered neighbors had formed a semicircle around us, drawn by the spectacle, whispering among themselves, some with amused smirks and others wide-eyed with disbelief. Kids crouched behind fences or peeked around parked cars, their voices hushed, whispering excitedly, "She's calling the cops on him again." I could feel the tension thick in the air, but I kept my calm. Calmness was its own form of authority, and I knew exactly how this would play out. Karen, for all her bluster and confidence, was walking a tightrope over the edge of public humiliation, and the neighborhood was watching every step. By the time she handed the complaint form to me, her hands were slightly shaking, her nails digging into the paper as if sheer force could imbue it with legitimacy. I took it with deliberate casualness, glancing at the top line, then at her expectant eyes. The irony was not lost on anyone present. Here she was, demanding police action, and the person she was attempting to accuse was the one holding the ultimate authority in the situation. I signed my initials at the bottom, not as a form of compliance, but simply to acknowledge receipt. "Received by Chief," I wrote in neat, deliberate letters. My signature was calm, controlled, and final. Karen's jaw dropped. Her eyes widened, momentarily losing focus, as if the reality of the situation was sinking in. A few neighbors stifled laughter. The children's whispers grew bolder, some giggling outright. A teenager in the corner was already raising their phone, recording the scene, likely to be shared across social media within minutes. Karen's sense of control, once so absolute, crumbled visibly, paper trembling in her hands as she stared at the words I had just scrawled. "But this is serious," she sputtered, her voice quivering as she tried to maintain some semblance of authority. "You can't, you have to, I demand." I held up a hand, motioning for her to stop, my voice calm but carrying weight. "Karen," I said, deliberately slow, so every word landed, "your complaint has been received as it should be. It will be logged, documented, and processed according to proper procedure. But please understand this. Filing a complaint against me, the chief of police, over a personal gasoline matter is ironic." I allowed a small pause, letting the words sink in. The word ironic seemed to hit her harder than any reprimand could have. Her mouth opened and closed like a goldfish, struggling for words. The neighbors were now fully engaged, some whispering among themselves, others exchanging knowing glances, recognizing that they were witnessing a rare, almost cinematic reversal of power. Karen tried to regain control, pointing at the paperwork and gesturing wildly. I have the right, my HOA rights, procedures, bylaws." "The bylaws," I said patiently, "do not authorize you to compel a neighbor to hand over personal property. They do not override the law. They do not override my position as chief. And they certainly do not grant authority over the fundamental principle of consent. This complaint is noted, and nothing more." Her face turned a deeper shade of red, a mix of fury, embarrassment, and disbelief. Every attempt to regain dominance failed spectacularly in real time, visible to every neighbor present. Her signature gestures of control, flailing papers, loud declarations, dramatic finger-pointing, had lost all effect. The public could see through the facade. The HOA president's power was revealed as fragile, performative, and utterly dependent on intimidation that no longer worked. Some neighbors began to whisper, commenting under their breath about the absurdity of the situation. A few couldn't resist capturing it on video, phones held high, filming the moment Karen realized she had overstepped spectacularly. "This is going to go viral," one muttered, grinning. Others nodded, appreciating the sheer theatricality of her downfall, while remaining discreet enough not to provoke a direct confrontation. Karen's voice grew shrill, the tension in her shoulders betraying her desperation. "I demand," she started again, but I cut her off, raising a single finger gently. "Karen," I said, calm and deliberate, "the escalation has been noted. The embarrassment you feel is a natural consequence of choosing procedure over reason, threats over dialogue, and coercion over cooperation. Let this be a lesson, not just for you but for everyone watching. Authority that is wielded without understanding, without respect, and without accountability is meaningless. Her hands trembled as she gripped the edges of the paperwork, now nearly crumpled, while the murmurs of the neighbors grew louder. The children whispered excitedly, pointing at the scene with quiet amusement, clearly savoring the public spectacle. Corinne's authority, which she had wielded like a weapon for years, was dissolving in front of her very eyes. I glanced around, allowing the silence to stretch for a moment. The crowd was fully engaged, waiting to see her next move, but I knew there would be none that could reclaim the situation. Every attempt to assert control had been neutralized by calm authority and the undeniable fact that she had miscalculated spectacularly. Finally, I returned the complaint form to her hands, not as a concession, but simply as a formal acknowledgement. Her fingers fumbled, the paper shaking as she held it, trying to salvage dignity where there was none. She looked around at the gathering neighbors, realizing that she had lost the moment, and that everyone present had witnessed the unraveling of her authority. Social media would have a field day. Already, a few smartphones were capturing video clips, ready to spread the story of Corinne's overreach and the spectacular irony of calling the police on the chief. The kids whispered gleefully, replaying each moment in their minds, while the adults nodded in quiet acknowledgement of the principles just demonstrated. As Corinne's shoulders slumped in defeat, I turned to the crowd, my voice carrying just enough authority to be heard clearly. "Let this serve as a reminder," I said, "that escalation without reason achieves nothing. Authority is not about volume, paper, or titles. It's about respect, fairness, and understanding. Everything else is just noise, and today we've witnessed exactly what that looks like." Corinne's face was red, her authority crumbled, and the neighborhood had learned a valuable lesson in real time. Attempting to manipulate systems, intimidate others, or overreach personal boundaries is a path to embarrassment when met with calm, lawful authority. And so the spectacle ended, not with fireworks, not with confrontation, but with a quiet, undeniable lesson in humility. Corinne retreated, muttering under her breath about procedures and rights, but the damage was done. The HOA's credibility had taken a hit, her power over the neighbors had slipped, and the story of her failed escalation would echo through the streets for weeks to come. The crowd began to disperse, some whispering excitedly about what they had just witnessed, others shaking their heads in disbelief. The children ran off, still giggling, some replaying the scene in their minds, already recounting it as the absurd drama of the year. And I, calm and composed, finally returned to my car, knowing that the Saturday chaos had reached its peak. Corinne's escalation had backfired spectacularly, and in the process, she had provided the neighborhood with a cautionary tale about the limits of authority, the importance of perspective, and the dangers of underestimating the people around you. A week had passed since the infamous gasoline incident, and the neighborhood had not forgotten. Whispers lingered on front porches, in driveways, and around morning coffee tables. The story had spread quickly, embellishments growing with each retelling, though the core truth remained clear. Corinne had overreached spectacularly, and the chief had handled it with calm authority. The HOA, ever concerned with optics and control, called a special meeting to address the incident. Invitations were formal but carried an unmistakable undertone of tension. The language was precise. Attendance required, discussion of neighborhood harmony and policy adherence mandatory, decorum expected. Everyone knew the meeting wasn't just about gasoline. It was about Corinne salvaging her image, about the HOA asserting control, and about neighborhood pride or amusement. I arrived punctually, not as a participant under scrutiny, but as a concerned neighbor. My attire was casual yet professional, a subtle reminder that I was there to observe, to participate, but not to be intimidated. The meeting room had been arranged meticulously, chairs aligned in neat rows, a long table at the front for the HOA board, and a podium that Corinne had chosen for herself, presumably to lend gravitas to her address. Neighbors trickled in, some eager to witness what promised to be an entertaining spectacle, others with apprehensive curiosity, still unsure how such a trivial matter had escalated to official HOA proceedings. A few cameras discreetly rested on tablet stands or smartphones, likely capturing moments for posterity or social media. Corinne, true to form, arrived in a crisp blouse, her hair perfectly styled, the very picture of authority, or at least, the image she wanted to project. She carried her stack of documents like armor, placing them ceremoniously on the podium. A hush fell over the room as she cleared her throat, preparing to deliver a carefully crafted lecture on morality, community, and the sanctity of sharing. "Good evening, neighbors," she began, voice measured and deliberate, though tinged with a tremor betraying her lingering frustration. "We are gathered here today to address an incident that has disturbed the harmony of our community. It concerns issues of sharing, ethics, and the responsibilities we have toward one another. Specifically," she gestured vaguely at the audience, eyes narrowing as if daring someone to object, "a refusal to uphold the principles of our neighborhood." A few residents shifted uncomfortably, some exchanging sideways glances. There was a subtle tension in the air, an unspoken acknowledgement that the topic might be more performative than substantive. Corinne's rhetoric, full of lofty words and moral undertones, aimed to establish herself as the guardian of community values, yet the memory of the gasoline incident cast a shadow over her authority. I raised my hand, smiling warmly, signaling both engagement and calm confidence. The room quieted, attention turning toward me. Corinne's lips tightened slightly as if she could sense the impending challenge. I stood, voice clear and steady, projecting the same composure that had diffused her previous public spectacle. "Community spirit is important," I began, allowing a moment for the words to settle, "and I absolutely support neighborly cooperation and shared responsibility. But coercion is not part of community spirit. Pressuring someone to surrender personal property or attempting to weaponize HOA rules against someone who upholds the law is not just counterproductive. It undermines trust, respect, and cohesion in our neighborhood." The room was silent, not the tense silence of confrontation, but the quiet that comes when a statement lands exactly as intended. Eyes flicked between me and Corinne, who now sat rigidly behind her podium, her carefully rehearsed lines collapsing under the weight of reality. The murmurs I had feared were absent, replaced instead by subtle smirks and knowing glances. Neighbors who had once whispered privately about the absurdity of Corinne's behavior now found themselves openly admiring the clarity and civility with which I had addressed the matter. Corinne's face flushed, her hands clenched slightly on the podium, and she opened her mouth to respond, only to find that words failed her. Her carefully honed lecture on ethics and morality felt hollow in comparison to the principle I had articulated: respect for boundaries, lawful conduct, and the proper exercise of authority. She realized, perhaps for the first time in public, that her personal sense of power had limitations. Titles, documents, and public perception could not override law, reason, or common sense. A few neighbors nodded subtly, whispering to each other. Finally, someone saying what we've been thinking. Others sat back in their chairs, a sense of relief washing over them. The tension that had pervaded the neighborhood since the incident began to dissipate, replaced by an appreciation for clarity and fairness. Corinne, however, remained tense, her hands smoothing over the papers in a futile attempt to regain composure. She glanced around the room, realizing that many were quietly, yet unmistakably, siding with reason over her dramatic narrative. "I want to clarify," I continued, packing slowly, deliberately, engaging the entire room with calm authority, that being part of an HOA is about cooperation, dialogue, and mutual respect. It is not about coercion, intimidation, or attempts to manipulate others. We resolve disputes not by escalating matters unnecessarily, but by understanding each other's boundaries and rights. That is how a neighborhood thrives, not by forcing compliance through fear or authority. Karen's lips pressed together, her jaw tight. I could see her calculating, realizing that any further verbal sparring would only deepen her own embarrassment. The audience, meanwhile, was captivated not by conflict, but by the lesson unfolding in front of them, a demonstration of how calm, reasoned authority can dismantle overreach and restore order without drama. A few of the younger neighbors exchanged glances and whispered quietly, "Did you see that? He just shut her down without raising his voice." The older ones nodded approvingly, appreciating the subtle, effective handling of what could have become yet another neighborhood scandal. The lesson was clear. Authority without accountability is fragile, but reason, respect, and lawful conduct carry weight far beyond titles or perceived control. Karen attempted one last rhetorical flourish, her voice slightly higher than intended, gesturing vaguely toward her papers. "But the rules of the HOA are." I held up a hand, gentle but firm, signaling the end of the lecture. "The rules of the HOA are important, but they do not grant the power to override personal rights or legal authority. Let us remember that community harmony is built on consent, communication, and respect. Anything else is just performance." The subtle smirks around the room became more visible, quiet nods replacing whispers. Even those who had once supported Karen's attempts at strict control now saw the wisdom in measured, lawful, and respectful leadership. Karen, realizing her final attempt at dominance had been neutralized, sank slightly in her chair, papers clutched uselessly in her hands. The room was silent for a moment, the calm authority I had exercised filling the space, emphasizing the contrast between reason and overreach, between principle and entitlement. Finally, the meeting began to shift. Residents started asking practical questions about neighborhood maintenance, upcoming events, and cooperative projects, leaving the gasoline fiasco as a cautionary tale rather than a central topic. Karen's attempts at moral lectures dwindled to defensive, muttered complaints, lost amid the practical concerns of the attendees. The room's attention had turned away from spectacle toward substance, guided by the principle I had articulated. By the time the meeting concluded, Karen had retreated into a quiet, contemplative silence, papers in hand but authority diminished. The neighbors dispersed slowly, some exchanging quiet congratulations or words of gratitude, others simply shaking their heads in amusement at the absurdity of the past week. The incident had become part of neighborhood lore, a lesson in the limits of perceived power and the importance of measured, lawful authority. As I left the meeting room, the subtle nods and smiles from neighbors reinforced the lesson that had been delivered, not with anger or confrontation, but with calm, reasoned explanation. Karen's authority had been publicly challenged and neutralized, her attempts at moral grandstanding exposed as empty when contrasted with lawful, respectful action. The HOA meeting, intended as a show of control, had instead cemented a principle far more enduring. Authority and respect are earned through fairness, integrity, and understanding, not assumed through position or title. And so the neighborhood learned yet again that balance, reason, and respect outweigh bluster and overreach, and that sometimes the quietest voice carries the greatest authority. Karen had been humbled, the community had learned, and the saga of the gasoline incident was far from over. But the lesson was clear. In this neighborhood, justice, principle, and calm authority always carry weight. The days following the HOA meeting unfolded with a quiet, almost imperceptible rhythm. Yet beneath the surface, the neighborhood had been set alight with whispers, chuckles, and subtle acts of collective amusement at Karen's expense. While I had no intention of officially punishing her, the law had been clear, and her overreach had already been checked. There was a different form of justice at play, one that was indirect, social, and remarkably effective. The neighborhood itself became the arbiter of accountability, and their methods, though subtle, were unmistakably powerful. It began with gossip. At first, it was confined to hushed conversations behind fences, over garden walls, or during the casual walk to the mailbox. Neighbors recounted the gasoline incident in painstaking detail, embellishing just enough to enhance the drama, yet keeping the essence intact. Karen had tried to leverage her position, the chief had remained calm and composed, and the outcome had been nothing short of humiliating. The story traveled faster than any official announcement could, spreading through front yards, cul-de-sacs, and over the hedges that divided properties. Children whispered it to each other in schoolyards, neighbors recounted it in grocery store lines, and the narrative gained its own momentum, independent of any formal record. Memes appeared next, not malicious but undeniably playful. A few tech-savvy residents created images of gas pumps with bold red letters spelling "not available" across them, with captions jokingly attributing them to the chief. Others photoshopped classic courtroom or superhero imagery, casting Karen in exaggerated villain poses, while I remained calm and stoic in the background, a symbol of measured authority. These images circulated quietly through neighborhood chat groups, text threads, and social media pages, often accompanied by emojis of laughter or knowing smirks. While Karen may not have immediately realized the scale of this digital commentary, the effect was palpable. Her perceived dominance was eroding with each shared post, each quiet laugh, and each viral image. Some neighbors, emboldened by the incident, began joking openly during casual interactions. One afternoon, while Karen attempted to lecture a small group about proper lawn care or communal garden responsibilities, a neighbor quietly whispered, "Careful, don't make the chief hear about this." The comment, seemingly casual, carried the weight of shared understanding. Karen's authority was no longer absolute, and every attempt at intimidation or overreach was now under the invisible scrutiny of someone whose presence could not be ignored. The neighborhood, in effect, had become a network of subtle checks, a social safety net against her recurring bluster. Karen tried in earnest to repair her image. She organized small community events, attempted to mediate disputes with a visible smile, and even offered to oversee minor landscaping projects, hoping to regain respect and credibility. Yet, each attempt was met with polite smiles, subtle reminders, or quiet jokes that undermined her authority without confrontation. A misplaced comment here, a teasing whisper there, and it became clear that the social fabric of the neighborhood no longer took her position at face value. Her credibility had been damaged, not through legal reprimand or dramatic confrontation, but through the quiet, collective judgment of her peers. One of the more amusing manifestations of this subtle revenge was the emergence of the so-called gas donation registry. It started as a private joke in a neighborhood group chat, a simple spreadsheet, humorously titled, listing residents, names, and availability for gas contributions. My name, of course, was listed as "not available" in bold letters. The spreadsheet became a running gag, referenced in casual conversations, screenshots shared privately, and even joked about at community gatherings. Karen, naturally, was made aware of the joke, though she could do little without appearing petty or reactive. Every mention of the registry elicited knowing glances and muffled laughter from the crowd, a quiet reinforcement of the lesson she had already learned. Her attempts to wield authority recklessly had consequences. The beauty of this form of revenge lay in its subtlety. There was no formal confrontation, no official reprimand, no public shamming in the legal sense. Instead, it was social, communal, and deeply satisfying. Karen's attempts to assert power were constantly checked by the collective awareness of the neighbors, each interaction subtly reminding her that the neighborhood was no longer under her unilateral control. Every overconfident statement, every attempt at moral superiority, was met with polite skepticism, quiet humor, or gentle social pressure. She had become, in essence, a character in a living cautionary tale, and the narrative unfolded continuously around her, keeping her in check without the need for direct enforcement. Children played their part unwittingly but delightfully. They whispered the story in schoolyards, shared snippets with friends, and repeated phrases like, "The chief might hear about this," during games, embedding the narrative in the next generation's memory of neighborhood life. Their innocence made the reminder even more potent. Even the youngest residents understood the limits of Karen's authority and the consequences of overreach. Adults, amused by the subtlety and cleverness of it all, added their own layer of commentary, ensuring the story's persistence. The humor and social accountability intertwined seamlessly, reinforcing the boundaries that Karen had ignored. At community gatherings, Karen's attempts to reclaim the spotlight often backfired in subtle ways. A comment she thought would inspire admiration would instead elicit knowing smiles or quiet chuckles. Her references to community responsibility were met with polite nods and whispered reminders of the gasoline incident. Each interaction reinforced the social lesson. Power assumed without respect, fairness, or understanding is fragile, easily undermined by the collective judgment of those around it. Karen's personal sense of importance was gradually tempered by the reality of social consequences, and she became increasingly aware that her reputation was no longer solely within her control. I observed all of this with quiet satisfaction, never needing to intervene, never needing to enforce formal punishment. The neighborhood itself had taken on the role of guardian, using humor, whispers, and shared memory to maintain balance and accountability. It was a form of revenge that required no confrontation, no anger, only patience and the simple act of letting social dynamics unfold naturally. Every smirk, every whispered joke, every meme served as a reminder that Karen's overreach had consequences far beyond the immediate incident. The satisfaction came not from malice, but from witnessing justice administered with subtlety and grace. Karen, for all her efforts, was reminded constantly that her attempts to dominate, intimidate, or manipulate had been noticed and quietly corrected by the neighborhood itself. The lesson was clear, embedded in everyday interactions, impossible to ignore, and immensely satisfying for anyone who had witnessed her hubris. In this quiet, indirect way, the neighborhood achieved what formal processes never could: enduring accountability and social reinforcement. Karen's credibility had been damaged beyond repair, not through confrontation, but through the persistent, subtle mechanisms of collective memory and gentle, pointed humor. Every time she attempted to assert authority, she was reminded, through whispers, glances, jokes, and memes, that her position was no longer unassailable. Every attempt at control now carried the weight of history, the memory of public correction, and the knowledge that the community's collective awareness was watching. It was, in every sense, subtle revenge. No official punishment, no dramatic confrontation, just the quiet, persistent echo of consequences that rippled through every interaction, every conversation, every glance across the street. And for me, witnessing this unfold, the satisfaction was complete. A small, measured justice that required neither anger nor escalation, only patience, observation, and the understanding that sometimes the quietest forms of accountability are the most effective. Karen's legacy in the neighborhood had shifted irreversibly. She would continue to participate, to attend meetings, and to oversee events, but the dynamic had changed. The power she once assumed without question had been redistributed subtly, socially, and irrevocably. Every whisper, every laugh, every social reminder reinforced the boundaries she had once tried to ignore. And the neighborhood, united in their quiet amusement and shared knowledge, ensured that the lesson would endure far longer than any formal complaint ever could. In the end, it was a quiet victory, a form of justice that required no grand gestures, no punitive measures, only the gentle, persistent enforcement of social awareness. And that, perhaps, was the most satisfying revenge of all. What began as a seemingly trivial, almost laughable demand for gasoline had evolved into a neighborhood saga that no one could ignore. In retrospect, the incident was absurd in its premise, yet it revealed truths far more substantial than any HOA document or committee rule. It demonstrated the delicate balance between authority and responsibility, the importance of boundaries, and the subtle ways in which power can be exercised without intimidation. While some neighbors still whispered about the incident with quiet amusement, the underlying lesson carried weight. Respect, fairness, and patience often speak louder than bluster, threats, or papered authority. Being the chief was not about asserting dominance or issuing orders at will. It wasn't about demonstrating power for the sake of appearances. True leadership, I realized, was about composure, the ability to remain calm under pressure, to evaluate absurdity without letting it provoke anger, and to act in a way that reinforced fairness and integrity. Karen's repeated attempts to escalate, to leverage HOA authority, and to demand compliance had provided a mirror reflecting not only her limitations, but also the importance of measured response. Each time she tried to push the envelope, I responded with patience, clarity, and adherence to principle, reinforcing that real authority is rooted not in fear, but in trust, respect, and reason. The neighborhood, meanwhile, absorbed the incident with a mixture of amusement and revelation. The gossip, the playful jokes, and the subtle social checks that emerged were reminders that power is rarely absolute. It is contingent upon perception, respect, and collective understanding. Karen had learned, perhaps reluctantly, that her attempts to impose control over others, especially over someone who held legitimate authority, could backfire spectacularly. Every whispered warning, every playful reference to "the chief might hear about this," every meme shared quietly in group chats, served as a persistent, indirect check on her behavior. She had become part of the neighborhood's collective lesson in humility and accountability, and while she continued to serve as HOA president in name, her influence had shifted subtly yet irreversibly. Karen eventually softened, though only slightly. The relentless humor, quiet reminders, and social awareness had tempered her impulses. She never requested gasoline again, nor did she attempt another public display of authority against someone she assumed she could intimidate. Her posture, once rigid with confidence, became more measured. Her speeches, once filled with grandiose assertions of control, were now tempered with cautious phrasing. While she maintained her title and responsibilities, the dynamic between her and the neighbors, and especially with me, had changed permanently. The lesson was clear. Even the most self-assured individuals have limits when confronted with reason, fairness, and authority grounded in law and patience. Reflecting on the entire episode, I realized that the true victory had little to do with confrontation or retribution. It had little to do with the embarrassment Karen had endured, or even the amusement of the neighbors. The real outcome was a reaffirmation of principles. Boundaries matter, respect matters, and measured, composed authority often carries more influence than any title or document ever could. In situations of absurdity, the temptation to escalate emotionally is strong, yet remaining calm, applying reason, and allowing social and procedural consequences to unfold can be far more powerful than direct confrontation. The neighborhood had learned its own lessons as well. They observed, participated subtly, and reinforced the social fabric that underpinned community life. The incident became a shared story, a touchstone for humor, and a reminder of the limits of assumed authority. Children, adults, and longtime residents alike absorbed the narrative, internalizing the principles without needing explicit instruction. Through whispers, jokes, memes, and everyday interactions, the lessons were communicated repeatedly, shaping perceptions and expectations for years to come. Ultimately, the episode reaffirmed a broader truth. Authority without accountability is fragile, and attempts to coerce or intimidate those with legitimate standing are rarely successful. By remaining calm, composed, and principled, the situation resolved itself not through conflict, but through clarity, patience, and the natural consequences of overreach. The universe, in its subtle and indirect way, had applied justice without the need for force or spectacle. Sometimes, the most effective form of victory is quiet endurance. By maintaining composure, respecting boundaries, and adhering to principle, it is possible to navigate absurdity with dignity, influence outcomes without conflict, and allow natural consequences to unfold in ways that teach lessons more effectively than confrontation ever could. The gasoline incident, trivial as it may have seemed, became a microcosm of these truths, a reminder that patience, fairness, and calm authority often achieve what anger, threats, and coercion cannot. And so, life in the neighborhood continued, punctuated by quiet nods, shared smiles, and the occasional playful reference to past events. Karen, for all her efforts to maintain control, had learned the hard way that real power lies not in intimidation, but in measured action and respect for boundaries. The neighborhood had been reminded that the law, reason, and integrity always carry weight. And I, having navigated the absurdity with composure, could reflect on a series of events that, while ridiculous on the surface, had reinforced the values that truly sustain communities: patience, fairness, and the subtle, enduring strength of principled authority. Sometimes the best way to win is simply to remain calm and let the universe, and the social dynamics it inspires, do the rest. And in this case, it worked perfectly.